Today, we become legends.
One of the less talked about changes between Smite 1 and Smite 2 was the complete removal of god classes. This has always been a strange one for me. It's not game breaking or anything, and veterans of the game will literally not care at all because they know what playstyle each god undertakes and don't need a class label to tell them that. But for newer players or players who don't play a wide variety of gods, this seems to have caused some confusion. So should the system be brought back? Let's talk. First up, why was this change even made in the first place? Smite's class system was fine, right? Well, no, it wasn't perfect, as it often led to situations where high-res pigeonholed themselves into forcing a god to play like an assassin or a warrior, such as Raven, who often found variability in the solo lane only for them to nerf his tank potential so that he stayed a jungler because he's an assassin. Erlang Shen is a good example of the reverse, where he often found variability in the jungle only to get nerfed from that role and even reworked to force him into being more of a solo laner through traditional role for warriors. The class system also led to restrictive design sometimes, where, for example, a lot of mages had fundamentally very similar kits because they were being designed around one core group of design goals that, quote, mages have to follow. This, of course, wasn't always the case. We had magical ADCs like Freya and Kronos, magical assassins like Alquang and Mama Brigitte, and even some more standard burst mages that had very atypical game plans like Tiamat or Nox. But this is a big reason why the devs pushed for the removal of classes in Smite 2. They wanted more flexibility between god playstyles and roles. That all being said, I do think these goals could have been achieved under a class system, just one with more flexibility within those classes. Maybe even with a few added classes to put focus on the new goal of flexibility, or even going as far as subclasses. The current Smite 2 system works on an honestly pretty confusing trait style system. For example, instead of being a warrior, Bellona's traits are brawler, tank, and lockdown. Or instead of being a mage, Aladdin's traits are slayer, burst damage, and mobility. This does work to a certain extent, and if you already know the game well, these traits are actually much more descriptive than a blanket class label. Especially in cases where the god in question is an atypical design like Aladdin. If there was a class system, Aladdin would be a mage, but slayer, burst damage, mobility describes him much better and shows that he's a magical assassin, not a standard burst mage. There are benefits to this system, but what I do think would be better is for these traits to still exist, but underneath a high level class system. So Aladdin would still be a mage, but he'd be a slayer, burst damage, high mobility mage. You could even go as far as to say classes don't determine damage type, in which case you just make Aladdin an assassin, but that might be deviating a bit too much from Smite 1's formula. A lot of existing Smite 1 players are conditioned to know that assassins do physical damage, mages do magical damage, etc. What I think will be the best way to approach this problem is expanding the Smite 1 class system to include two new classes, Enchanter and Brawler. You could go further and add even more classes, such as to differentiate high damage guardians from more peel focused guardians, or ability hunters from auto attack hunters, but at some point you're just going to end up with what is effectively the current Smite 2 trait system, so I think adding just two new classes would keep the pool small enough, but allow for more defined boundaries that make more sense. The Enchanter class will be your more utility focused mages that aren't solely aimed at dealing as much burst damage as possible. From the current Smite 2 roster, that would be Aphrodite, Baron Samedi, Hecate, Ra, and potentially Nuwa, Hades, and the Morrigan, depending on how broad you want the definition to go. If you wanted to go really ham, you could even include stuff like Yamoja and Kepri under this tag, but then it might get confusing with tanks occupying the same class as Squishy, so you probably won't go that far. Some other enchanters that aren't in Smite 2 yet from Smite 1 would be Changa, Hel, Ishel, Nox, Iset, and maybe Tiamat. This will break up the absolutely absurdly large mage class into burst mages and enchanters to more clearly define the strengths and weaknesses between them. The same will be done with the Brawler class, but this time for your more high damage aggressive warriors and your more tanky frontline assassins. The current Smite 2 gods I would consider brawlers are Chak, Fenrir, Mordred, Mulan, Thor, and maybe Bellona. Some others not in Smite 2 yet will be Erlang Shen, Gilgamesh, Achilles, Lancelot, Raven, and maybe Ratatoska, depending on how they do his Acons for Smite 2. The Brawler class would fit that middle ground between warriors and assassins, as the lines are very often blurred between these two classes, with some of the more high damage aggressive warriors like Erlang, Gilgamesh, and Achilles often being played like bruiser assassins, and some of the more bulky assassins like Raven, Fenrir, and Thor often being played like high damage, high mobility warriors. Having a class that's in between could more clearly define these characters, and honestly Mordred feels like he was built for this new class from the ground up with his warrior assassin hybrid style. The remaining warriors would have a more clear identity as frontline tanks with high crowd control, and the remaining assassins would have a more clear identity as high mobility in and out glass cannons, while the brawlers fill that role of a bruiser with a bit of both styles. Adding these two new classes into Smite 2 and returning the original 5 would solve some of the issues that led to the removal of classes in the first place. It wouldn't solve all of them by any means. You'd still have oddities like Aladdin being in the same class as Anubis or Cabrakan being in the same class as Kepri, but some of that stuff is unavoidable without having 20 different classes, and at that point you're just doing Smite 2's trait system under a different coat of paint. I can also somewhat see why Smite never decided to expand the class offerings, and that's simply because 5 classes with 5 roles is extremely easy to understand as a beginner. It's very easy to tell someone who's just learning the game that most warriors play solo lane, most mages play mid, most hunters play ADC, most guardians play support, and most assassins play jungle. But with them doing away with the class system entirely for Smite 2, that whole concept is sort of off the table, and I think having 7 classes and saying something like most junglers are assassins or brawlers, or most supports are guardians or enchanters would still be better than trying to explain the current trait system to a new player. Expanding to 7 classes but keeping the trait system underneath would be a nice middle ground in my opinion, between keeping flexibility in mind while also making it easier for new players to understand what gods to go where at a glance. Of course, Smite is a complex game, and at some point a beginner will have to dive deeper than just mages go mid if they want to improve at the game, which is where I think the trait system does well as a secondary system underneath an expansion of classes. Once they get a feel for what classes go where, they can start to say, oh, this hunter is being played in mid and their traits are burst damage and pressure compared to most ADC hunters that are sharpshooter and constant damage. Maybe I'll try this other hunter that is also burst damage and pressure in the mid lane and see if that works. Doing it this way seems like the best of both worlds, allowing new players to get a quick, easy grasp of what goes where through classes and allowing them to dive deeper when they feel ready and explore how Smite actually works at a higher level of play through the trait system. I also generally don't think you need to remove classes in order to design the game around role flexibility and varying playstyles. That was the core reason they removed classes in the first place, because they wanted Smite 2 to be more open in how you approach playing certain gods and roles, which for the record I think has been amazing so far, and I would not want them to backtrack on that idea. Pigeonholing gods into certain playstyles or roles is something I hated in Smite 1 for its entire life cycle, and it ruined one of my favorite gods, Erlangshen, by forcing him into the solo lane and out of jungle just because he's a warrior, lol. But I don't think you have to remove classes in order to achieve this goal. Expanding classes to include a couple more and leaving the trait system underneath that will provide the framework for making gods more flexible while retaining that high level overview that newer players found useful in the class system. As I touched on a bit earlier in this video, you could even go as far as a subclass system where you have mages, but then underneath that you have sorcerers, enchanters, rune shooters, and spellblades to break up the class into more defined roles. But honestly, I don't think you really need to go that far, and a simple expansion of the class system and keeping traits underneath that will provide the best balance of learnability and accurate descriptions. But what do you think though? Are you a fan of the class removal or not? And are you a fan of my solution or not? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.